Hello everyone, welcome to From the Star Wars Library, where Star Wars is in print, the Force is with the readers, and we're heading back to 1979 for the second original Star Wars novel ever released. I'm your host, Nathan P. Butler, and this time we are removing ourselves from the whole comic strip and comic book thing that seems to have been the focus of this series in most respects up until now. You may recall that back in 1976, we had the release of the novelization of A New Hope, and in 1978, we had the release of Splinter of the Mind's Eye. But generally speaking, Star Wars has been dead in terms of novels since then, with most of the EU of the time, the licensed spin-off materials at least of the time, being produced by Marvel Comics or the Los Angeles Times newspaper strip. We have the stories from Pizzazz, the Marvel regular comics, and of course, the stuff we got from the newspaper strips and whatnot. Now we finally return to Star Wars in novel form with a fondly remembered Star Wars writer. Most people best know Brian Daley as the man who wrote the Star Wars radio dramas that appeared on National Public Radio that were so successful, so great, inspired so many people in the fan audio and podcasting genre these days. But he also had a chance to write for Star Wars in novel form, but it's often forgotten in the wake of the greatness that was those radio dramas. His novels formed what are often referred to these days as the Han Solo Adventures, not to be confused with the Han Solo Trilogy by Anne Crispin. Now, a lot of folks these days have probably read these stories in this form right here. This is Star Wars, the Han Solo Adventures. This is the 1992 omnibus printing that includes all three of Brian Daley's Han Solo novels, Han Solo at Star's End, Han Solo's Revenge, and Han Solo and the Lost Legacy. But of course, this is an omnibus. It's a reprinting of these books, not the way they were originally printed. This story was originally printed back in 1979, back in April of 79. And again, just like with Splinter of the Mind's Eye, just like with the A New Hope novelization, like any of the books being produced in Del Rey in their first chance writing for Star Wars, it was released originally in paperback. This is Han Solo at Star's End, the original paperback edition, granted beat up, as part of my collection here, as released back in 1979. What we have is a story focusing on Han and Chewbacca, set prior to the events of A New Hope, about 2 years prior to the events of A New Hope, actually during the events of the Han Solo Trilogy by Anne Crispin that will be written much later on. Now, they could not use the Empire as the bad guys in this particular story, so instead, Han and Chewie are in an area controlled by the Corporate Sector Authority, or the CSA. Now, that may sound like, well, yeah, we know who the Corporate Sector Authority is these days. That might sound familiar to modern audiences. This is where that organization was created. So, the Corporate Sector Authority was created for this book. Yeah, its roots in the EU go back further in terms of continuity and chronology, but in terms of actual writing, publishing in the real world, this was the beginning. This is also the book that sees the introduction for the first time ever of Z-95 Headhunters, those precursors to the X-Wing Starfighter that we're now seeing even being used in Lucas's own materials in the Clone Wars cartoon series. So it's something that brings with us a lot of first. Brian Daley's first Star Wars novel, first Z-95 Headhunters, first time we see the Corporate Sector Authority, etc., etc., etc. The idea here is that when the Millennium Falcon is damaged, Han needs help from his friend Doc. Doc is not there, he's been taken away, and presumably is going to be at the prison known as Star's End on Midas 7. So we see the whole adventure of Han and others trying to break into this prison, find the people they're looking for. At one point, Chewbacca himself winds up getting captured, so he's also trying to save Chewbacca along with Doc and others. And in the process, he runs afoul, of course, of the Corporate Sector Authority leaders that are there, like Hurkin, for instance, themselves, and Ol Rashan, who is sort of the enforcer that's there for Hurkin. And you get this great sort of synergy of, you got the paranoia story of who is it that might be a traitor among the ship. You wind up getting the sort of jailbreak thing going on. You get the introduction of all these different new elements. You get space battles. You get Han being his wisecracking self prior to joining the Rebel Alliance, so he still has a lot of that mercenary spirit here. There's not a lot of I'm doing this for the good of everyone kind of mentality to him at all. It really is a nice way to see a glimpse at one of our major Star Wars characters, one of the big three, Han Solo, with, of course, Chewbacca from, what, the Big Ten, whatever you're going to call the next group. Although I guess that assumes that they're playing some type of college sports. Han gets to be seen here in his element, and we get a little bit of background. And honestly, it doesn't reveal much about his background. Not really. But for those who were reading it at the time, this was big news. Holy crap, it's a story of Han Solo prior to A New Hope. This is awesome. And it really is a good read. It's not a great read, remember, you got to read it with sort of your mindset in the sense of what time it was being written in and what we didn't know in the Star Wars universe just yet. But it's certainly a better read, in my opinion, than Splinter of the Mind's Eye, which focused on Luke and Leia and had Vader in it. Those sort of distinctive Star Wars elements are missing here to a degree. It's really just Han, Chewie, and a bunch of stuff that is introduced as sort of general sci-fi that happens to now be set in the Star Wars universe. But it is a fun read because Brian Daley writes pretty well. You may also know that Brian Daley is the one who teamed up with James Luceno, who's also another Star Wars writer later on, and they wrote under the name Jack McKinney and wrote that great 21-book novel series of Robotech that took the stories from the anime, that took those 3 animes and combined them for the US as Robotech. It went through and sort of novelized that, gave that more depth, and then added stories set between the different series of that. So Brian Daley is someone that I am somewhat familiar with because of that and because of Star Wars and his radio dramas. He's a man who was really lost before his time. He died actually during the production of the Return of the Jedi radio drama, but that's something that is dealt with a little bit more in one of my visual showcase reviews of the limited collector's edition of the radio drama set. Suffice to say, this is an unusual thing. It's focusing on Han, and it is the second original Star Wars novel, at least, released ever, and the first part of the Han Solo Adventures. It is also unique as part of the Han Solo Adventures in that it is the only one of those stories by Brian Daley to eventually be adapted in comic form. We don't usually see Star Wars comics being made based on the novels. It's very rarely happened. We had one for Splinter of the Mind's Eye, eventually. We had the Thrawn trilogy being done like that. But for the most part, it doesn't happen. Especially not in an era of comic strips as opposed to individual comic book issues. But it did happen for Han Solo at Star's End. In 1980, Archie Goodwin, as he was coming on as the new writer, not just of the Marvel series, but of the comic strips as well for the Los Angeles Times newspaper syndicate, would go through and adapt Han Solo at Star's End, not the whole trilogy, just this one, as a comic strip to be aired, again, in 1980, or to be released in 1980. Then eventually in 1997, we would see Dark Horse Comics take those and turn them into another classic Star Wars release, in this case, classic Star Wars, Han Solo at Star's End, albeit with some different changes to the way the characters looked, which is something that we'll deal with a little while later when we see that series in depth. But it was originally released by Dark Horse Comics in collected form here, Dark Horse, Comics, as classic Star Wars Han Solo at Star's End, issues 1 through 3, albeit later released as a trade paperback, which is the way you would tend to find it now. So, Han Solo at Star's End is an essential read, and can it be skipped? Well, it's not an essential read. There's nothing necessary in the background here, unless you're going to be trying to read all 3 of the Han Solo Adventures stories. But it's an essential part of the overall expanded universe in that it gives us this new branching out of the Star Wars novels that hadn't really happened all that much, except for Splinter of the Mind's Eye. Can it be skipped? Sure. Is it essential? No. But it is a cool thing to go back and read. And if you're going to go back and read some of the early Star Wars novels from Del Rey, the Han Solo Trilogy really is the best trilogy to pick up. Or excuse me, Han Solo Adventures Trilogy is the best one to pick up. And you can find it individually, sometimes in hardback from the Sci-Fi Book Club, but this was the original printing, the paperback. These days you'll tend to mostly find it, though, in omnibus form as the easiest way to get your hands on all 3 for a very cheap price. I'd recommend checking it out, even if it's not essential here. It brings Star Wars back into novels, and that is a good thing. Until next time, thank you for watching, and may the Force be with the readers.